Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering commitment to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. Thank you so very much for joining me today. If, dear friend, you find these conversations entertaining, enlightening, edifying, stimulating to the mind, or nourishing to the soul, please do consider subscribing to this channel. Like this episode, and share it with a family member or a close friend. My distinguished guest today, with whom I'm absolutely excited to have the opportunity to talk, is the great Scott Shane. A highly decorated reporter, Scott plied his trade at the Baltimore Sun and the New York Times for 21 and 15 years, respectively. He's the author of 3 fine books, all available on Amazon or at your local brick and mortar bookstores, of which you should, the moment this episode is over, purchase yourself and your loved ones a copy. Dismantling Utopia, which examines the inglorious collapse of the USSR, Objective Troy, which looks into the airstrike that killed an American jihadi terrorist, Anwar al-Awlaki, and most recently, and that to which we'll be dedicating most of our time today, Flee North. Scott is a fellow at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute at Maryland's esteemed Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches courses on the media, a field of study for whose elucidation a man of Scott's intellectual power is most urgently needed. Scott, welcome to the show. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Daniel.
It's my pleasure. So there are countless fascinating topics into which I'd like to delve, but I'd better begin with the extraordinary main characters on whom your latest book, Flee North, focuses. And they are Thomas Smallwood and Charles Turner Torrey. So my questions to you are, who were these men? How is it that they have, by and large, escaped the notice of history? And how did you become aware of them?
So this story goes actually back about 25 years. I was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun and had been for some years. And I stumbled onto the fact that the domestic slave trade, the slave trade shipping thousands of enslaved people from the upper South to the deep South, mostly into the cotton plantations, had thrived around Baltimore's Inner Harbor. And it happened that the Inner Harbor was one of our favorite places at the time. Our kids were little, and we would push them in strollers around the water and look at the boats and buy food. And it came as a particular shock that this brutal trade had been operating for decades in the 19th century around the now kind of peaceful, touristy Inner Harbor. And that led me to write a long story for the Baltimore Sun about the domestic slave trade. And it became a topic that I wanted to return to, and, had thoughts about a book. But as I looked into the slave trade, it was hard for me to find characters, basically the material, to support a complete story, a complete book. And I kind of enlarged my research a little bit and started looking at other characters who were engaged in slavery and the battle against slavery in the region where I live, around Baltimore, Washington. And I had heard that, I'd seen somewhere that there was an abolitionist who had died in the Maryland penitentiary. And I started looking at him, and that was Charles Torrey. And as I read more about Charles Torrey, I saw that there was a guy associated with him in organizing escapes from slavery by the name of Thomas Smallwood. And in the relatively little that was written about Charles Torrey, Smallwood was often portrayed essentially as Charles Torrey's black sidekick. And then as I looked into Thomas Smallwood, I kind of came to understand it was really very much the other way around, that Smallwood was sort of the key figure in organizing these escapes in the early 1840s. And that Torrey, who was a younger man and who was from Massachusetts and therefore didn't know the turf around Baltimore and Washington, it was really it was the other way around. And Charles Torrey was Thomas Smallwood's white sidekick and partner helper. And the more I got into the story of Thomas Smallwood, the more I realized he was really the center of this book. Not only because he played the key role in organizing mass escapes from slavery in Washington, from the counties around Washington, from Baltimore and the counties around Baltimore, but also because he had written a series of extraordinary newspaper dispatches that he sent off to an Albany paper, an abolitionist paper in Albany, New York. And these dispatches sort of describe some of the escapes, mock the slaveholders, celebrate the people escaping from them, and they're written in an extraordinary satirical style that I think owes a lot to Charles Dickens and Smallwood, whose activities were completely illegal and extremely dangerous. Hid his own identity behind a pseudonym he borrowed from Charles Dickens. And as far as I could tell, these were the only real-time accounts of escapes that were published literally every week or two as the escapes were going on. And then finally, I kind of stumbled across the fact that the term Underground Railroad seemed to have originated with Smallwood. So he becomes the center of my book. Charles Torrey becomes the second major character. And because part of my whole goal in setting out on this mission was to spread the word about the domestic slave trade, which I find the vast majority of Americans really have no idea about its scale and its nature. So the third character in there was essentially was at the time basically the mortal enemy of Smallwood and Torrey, and the largest slave trader of the time, a guy named Hope Slatter, with the ironic name of Hope. Although to fall into Hope Slatter's clutches was basically to have no hope. So anyway, I built the book around these three characters, and essentially the Underground Railroad and the domestic slave trade at that time, about 20 years before the Civil War.
Yeah, and I think it's expertly done, the way in which you do introduce these three otherwise unknown characters and really flesh them out and create this life that hitherto was unknown. I want to ask you about Thomas Smallwood's style. Now, he's described in your book and in other accounts as having been a daring activist and a searing writer. Now, he wrote behind a Dickensian pseudonym, as you noted. He was a literate man, and he was a big fan, as most people were at the time, of Dickens, whom he may or may not have squired around the city. But we'll maybe talk about that momentarily. But his style was, by any metric, brazen. He would openly mock the slavers from whom he stole and was unhesitant in naming names. And that was totally unique for that time. I want you, as a writer and as a chronicler of people, to cast your judgment on his style. Do you think that it was effective at the time? Do you think that others that might have been a little bit more conservative, like Frederick Douglass, about whom I want to talk as well, do you think that they were right to sort of shy away from that, or maybe even to openly disavow that style?
Well, I guess there's a couple of questions here. One is, was this a smart thing to be doing? Not only was he publishing these dispatches which used the real names of the slaveholders and the real names of the people escaping from them, literally a week or two after the escapes occurred, he insisted that the Albany editors mail a copy of any paper that mentioned a particular slaveholder to that slaveholder in Washington or Baltimore, this region down here, because they were otherwise unlikely to see it. And he basically wanted to rub their faces in the fact that he had helped spirit away their enslaved workers, and that he thought basically this was a great thing and tough luck for them. So Frederick Douglass, as you mentioned, was critical of writing too much about the escapes, the Underground Railroad, for fear of essentially raising the guard of slaveholders, helping slave catchers run after people who might have escaped. He thought as a question of operational security for the Underground Railroad, it was a bad idea. And you can argue that that point certainly it was certainly a daring and risky thing to do. But in terms of his literary style, it's very unusual. A lot of the abolitionist writing at the time was ponderous, maybe outraged, often religious and very kind of somber. And this is absolutely the opposite of that. It's sort of lighthearted. Sometimes, actually, he uses these letters for different purposes. Sometimes it's quite scathing, certainly towards the slave catchers and the slaveholders. But it's also sometimes quite hilarious. And he basically turns the society, or the conventional view of the society of the America of the 1840s, upside down. The slaveholders are accustomed to thinking of themselves as wise and intelligent and capable. And indeed, they justified slaveholding in part because these people from Africa and their descendants were incapable in their view of looking after themselves. And so it was sort of a service they provided, let's say, that they would keep these people in their households and look after them and tell them what to do. So Smallwood takes this and turns it completely upside down and portrays the enslaved people who were escaping as wily, witty, canny, highly intelligent, and very capable, which is why they're able to pull off these escapes. And the slaveholders as a group are portrayed as sort of numbskulls, sort of befuddled, pampered people who are, he turns the tables. He says these are people who basically are incapable of caring for themselves. So they have to have their meals made for them, their clothes brought to them. So they're sort of this pampered, bewildered class of people who don't know how it is that these people who have helped them to kind of get through life have suddenly disappeared. So it's a very funny and unusual style, and he can be quite sharp-tongued. And it's interesting that when the first of these letters was published in the Albany paper, then called Tocsin of Liberty, Tocsin, an old word for bell. So it basically was called Liberty Bell. And in this paper, one of the editors, who remained nameless, sort of apologizes for one of Smallwood's dispatches, saying that, basically, geez, if we'd read it, we would have cut some of that out. And it's a little hard to know what he's referring to because he's indirect. But Smallwood had taken a slap at a prominent politician, Henry Clay, and of the time, a famous senator, Henry Clay, in part because he's talking about a black boy named Henry Clay and suggesting that there may be more than a coincidence in in the coincidence of names, and that possibly Senator Henry Clay was this guy's father. Anyway, I don't know exactly what it was that Smallwood said that must have offended some readers, but there's this apology, and so you don't know how this is going to go. But within, I don't know, a few months, Charles Torrey, who has been helping Smallwood organize escapes down in D.C. and Baltimore, he takes off and moves up to Albany and becomes the editor of the paper. And by the time he takes the editorship there, these dispatches from Smallwood, using the name from Dickens, Sam Weller, these dispatches have apparently become very popular because I worked in newspapers for 40 years, and there's what you call a house ad. A house ad is just an ad for the newspaper in the newspaper, and so they're running house ads that feature the letters from Sam Weller and the Underground Railroad and so on. So I think they quickly caught on with readers and became one of the things that people look for in the paper. So it's a very unusual, essentially serial work of literature. And I put 7 of these letters in the back of the book, and next year I'll be actually editing a volume of the complete works of Thomas Smallwood, which, alas, I wish they were much more voluminous. But anyway, all of the letters and Thomas Smallwood's short memoir will be collected into a single volume.
Oh, for which I await eagerly. I can't wait, because there is some extant material from Smallwood's hand, but as you know, it's somewhat sparse. It's difficult to find online for a layperson just searching. Now, you listeners out there and viewers, you can certainly go on Wikipedia, and there's a somewhat, I wouldn't say sizable entry for Smallwood, but there is some information there. But really, truly, if you want to familiarize yourself with this indispensable character in the history of America, you need to get Scott's book, because it really, like I said, gives a lot of flesh to his person. You mentioned something that I found very interesting, and that's the humorizing of the tyrannical regime in an attempt to discredit the institution of any institution by not quite satirizing it, because he wasn't doing that, but unveiling some of the ridiculousness that is behind it. And it's a way of rendering impotent those who wield the power. Maybe you can comment a little bit on that, because a lot of the abolitionist literature at that time did not take that tack.
Yeah,
for which Smallwood became at least regionally famous.
Yeah.
There was a lot more moralizing. We think of, Garrison's writings and those of Douglas, and it was a very, like you said, much more somber, and rightfully so, dealing with a somber issue, that of the enslavement of our fellow human creatures. But in Smallwood's case, he really took a different perspective, and I wonder, if that was just a characteristic of his, if maybe he was a more kind of lighthearted, funny individual, that might have just been his personality, or if he deliberately, wanted to kind of cut the legs out under some of these, prestigious slave traders, domestic slave traders, and show them to be the small men that they really were.
I think that's a fascinating question, why he chose this style, because you certainly sense, kind of behind the style is a seething hatred of the institution of slavery and the people who make it work. But he does very deliberately choose this. I think it is a satirical style. Personally, I would call it satire. For example, just something that pops to mind. He talks about a local official. I believe he may be the British consul, anyway, who's a slaveholder. And it says something, he married he married I forget what the number is, the 1,000 slaves of one man with his daughter attached. And so he's saying that obviously the man married the daughter who owned a whole lot of enslaved people, who enslaved a lot of people. But Smallwood's way of expressing that is that this is very much a financial transaction, and he was married to this human property, which was worth a ton of money. So he was basically marrying up and marrying somebody who was extremely wealthy with the daughter attached as this kind of accoutrement. Anyway, and so, but as I was saying, he's addressing people who are well off, sort of by definition. I mean, if you owned an enslaved person in the mid-Atlantic at that time, the value of that person might be anywhere from $500 to $1,000 or more. And to convert it to today's money, it's 30 or 35 times. So, if it was $1,000, that would be, somebody would be worth $30,000 in our money. So if you had 10 of those people, that's $300,000. So anyway, if you were a significant slaveholder, you were somebody who had a lot of wealth. And so you're accustomed to thinking of yourself as sort of a big wheel, a leader in society. So to portray them, not by denouncing them in a sort of Old Testament voice of denunciation, which in a way enlarges them and makes them into, a very powerful, perhaps evil, but powerful figure. Smallwood's style cuts them down to size, and he is, he's basically saying, you people can't even get your own meals, and we have, and as he says at one point, your walking property has walked off. So I think the effectiveness of the style is to essentially deeply insult and dismantle the slaveholders' self-image. And in fact, quite explicitly, Smallwood and Torrey, when they got into the escape business, they were doing this in part because both had been involved for years in talking about the evils of slavery. And I think they basically wanted to do something very practical about the evils of slavery. And there was nothing more practical than moving somebody from a state of slavery to a state of freedom. And if they followed Smallwood's advice, they would keep going all the way until they were crossed the boundary into the British Empire, into Canada, where slavery had been abolished about a decade earlier, and where they would be safe from the clutches of the bounty hunters and slave catchers who were prowling around even the far northern states. So they wanted to do this very practical thing for these families and individuals. But at the same time, they kind of imagined that there was a strategy lurking behind it. And the strategy would be to demoralize the slaveholders, essentially. It made sense. It was a logical kind of strategy, in the sense that if you owned 10 people and they were worth, in today's terms, $20,000 or $30,000, and they literally disappeared overnight, and you had no idea where they had gone. They were using wagons, for the most part, covered wagons, to make people disappear. So they would cram 10, 15, even 20 people into a wagon, men, women, children, and they would take off in the middle of the night and disappear. And so you had people from multiple households disappearing in one night. You can imagine kind of the next day, word gets around that, 3 people are gone from this household, 5 people are gone from another. And the slaveholders are talking to each other. and trying to figure out what to do about this and where the people might have gone, and are they gone for good? Are they just, skipping work, or what's going on? And the idea was to demoralize the slaveholders who were watching, a large part of their wealth vanish into thin air. And I kind of did a rough calculation for a particular wagon load, 15 people, that maybe the value on the slave market at the time of those people might add up to about $200,000. So, to me, this is kind of like a bank robbery. It's like a massive heist. And these guys, the goal here would be to convince the slaveholders that this system is not actually working for them, and that they will be better off hiring people and paying them for their labor than trying to buy people and enslaving them and wringing the labor out of them. And in fact, Smallwood, in the guise of Sam Weller, at one point does describe overhearing two guys whose walking property had walked off, saying, "I'm not going to buy another slave. I'm done with this business. I just can't risk putting a lot of money into human property and then having it disappear again." So, of course, he was very encouraged by this. And, I think their perhaps grandiose notion was, if you do this enough, and if enough people in the area around Washington, Baltimore, reach this same conclusion, that perhaps the institution of slavery will begin to die out in the mid-Atlantic. And, there you have the federal government in Washington. And how could it not be influenced by the decay of this institution locally? And, so Torrey in particular, who was more given than Smallwood to sort of flights of fancy, I guess you could say, he talks about tearing down the entire, fabric of slavery. And so, he at least imagined that maybe they were pulling on a thread that would unravel the whole tapestry. Alas, that was not to be. But it was, that was sort of the strategy. And so mocking the slaveholders, I think, was in a way a part of that strategy.
Yeah, I have a few remarks. One is that I think it was a beautiful marriage between Smallwood and Torrey, for the reason that one actually lived a good portion of his life up until the age of 30 as a slave. So he had actual practical experience in that world, whereas Torrey was a Yaley. He was from the Northeast. And like you said, was more inclined toward these flights of kind of abstract fancy, which are well placed in some instances and necessary in others, but maybe not as effective in bringing about the end to this institution. So I do think that the two combined were effective in bringing together their peculiar powers. And I want listeners to think about this. It's an uncomfortable thought, but many American homes have 2 or even 3 automobiles outside their homes. Just imagine awakening one morning to find that your $25,000 Toyota Corolla and your $35,000 Dodge pickup truck are suddenly gone, right? And again, it's a disquieting thought to consider the fact that human beings were basically equivalent to property such as that.
Yes.
But just based purely on their monetary value, they were in many parts of this country. So, imagine your feelings if all of a sudden very valuable assets for which you paid good money and on which you rely for your daily bread are gone. They're vanished, taken, and you have no real recourse aside from the fugitive slave laws, which at this point are somewhat unreliable and maybe just kind of coming into their formulation. And just a term I wrote down when you called it a heist. I think of it as a humanitarian heist. So maybe just justifiable on some grounds, I think.
Absolutely.
That
Absolutely.
that the Southerners might not concur with, but nonetheless, two directions in which I want to go, and maybe I'll begin with talking about the internal slave trade versus the foreign slave trade, and also I want to talk a little bit more about the Underground Railroad, exactly what it is. You gave a good foreshadowing of that, but I want to get into that in a little bit more detail. But first, in his scathing, eloquent essay, "What to the Slave is the Fourth of July," Frederick Douglass describes America's internal slave trade, from which Hope Slatter, another one of the third of your characters, amassed a small fortune in the following terms. And I'm quoting Douglass. He says that the foreign slave trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy. And again, Douglass is writing in the first part of the 19th century. It has been denounced with burning words from the high places of the nation as an execrable traffic opposed alike to the laws of God and man. To arrest it, to put an end to it, this nation keeps a squadron at immense cost on the coast of Africa. But while so much execration is poured out by Americans upon those engaged in the foreign slave trade, the men engaged in the slave trade between the states pass without condemnation, and their business is deemed honorable. So you touched on this briefly, and I think it's a subject on which Americans need to be educated a little bit more, and I'm hoping for you to provide that education. Can you explain to us the difference between the foreign slave trade, with which our mind associates the enslavement of Black Africans being brought to America via the Middle Passage, and the internal slave trade, which continued on after the year 1808 in America?
Yes. That is really what brought me to this topic in a lot of ways. And so, I think when you say domestic slave trade to most Americans, they have a vague idea of people being sold from one plantation to another. Maybe they've seen the site of an auction, a slave auction block or something in some southern town. But I think most people don't understand the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that when the Constitution was written, there was essentially a compromise. And the compromise said that the African slave trade, slave trade, the kidnapping of people in Africa and their forced transport to the United States would not be ended for at least 20 years. And there were voices on both sides of the debate back then. And then by the time 1807 came around, it was 20 years later, and it was going to be the first time that under the Constitution, the African trade, the international slave trade, could be banned. There was a majority in favor of banning it, and for multiple reasons. Not all of them as admirable as one might think. Because part of it was that in the intervening years, there was actually a surplus of labor in the Upper South, particularly in the Chesapeake region, the Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, Maryland, where tobacco had been the dominant crop for a very long time. Tobacco was a very labor-intensive crop, required a lot of hands to pick it and dry it and so on. And so there were large enslaved workforces. But tobacco also wears out the soil very over time. And so a lot of tobacco farmers were switching over to grains and other crops that were much less labor intensive. So they ended up with more enslaved workers than they needed. And in fact, in the early years of the 19th century, there were quite a few manumissions in a state like Maryland. In other words, enslavers going to court and essentially saying, "You're now free." And again, it might not be for completely admirable motives, because it might be just that they say, "I don't need this guy's labor, so I don't want to feed him anymore. I don't want to house him anymore." But in any case, what happened, so you might have even imagined that slavery would die out in that region, die a natural death. But what happened instead was that Eli Whitney, as everybody learned in school, invented the cotton gin, and the cotton gin made it much more efficient to process cotton. And it led to a boom in cotton growing in the Deep South. And so there was insatiable demand for labor from the cotton plantations and also the sugar plantations in the Deep South. So you have this sort of imbalance, and in our capitalist system, naturally people pop up to take advantage of the fact that these human beings were worth less in the Upper South than they were in the Deep South. And so you have guys like Hope Slatter, the leading slave trader of the era, based in Baltimore, who is buying people from their enslavers in Maryland, for the most part, in D.C. and Virginia, and in either the slave trader would either organize them into what were called coffles, C-O-F-F-L-E, which was men chained together, literally chained together, often with women and children walking behind, and they would be marched hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Deep South, and often with a guy with a gun on horseback at the front and another one at the back in case anyone tried to run. Or the other way, particularly out of Baltimore, the way people were moved south was generally by ship. So Hope Slatter had a so-called slave jail on the Baltimore, very near the Baltimore harbor, the inner harbor that I talked about, and he would accumulate people. He had agents out around, going around Maryland, buying up people. They'd be taken to this slave jail, private slave jail near Baltimore's harbor, and he would accumulate essentially a shipload. And then every month or so, he would load 50, 70, 80, 100 people onto a ship, and it would, carry people usually all the way around Florida in the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And New Orleans was a major slave port. And in New Orleans, Hope Slatter, believe it or not, had something they literally called a showroom, where these people would be put on display and sold basically to the highest bidder, and then, carted out into the to the cotton plantations, the sugar plantations, where which were pretty brutal factory farms. And I think the overriding tragedy and crime of the domestic slave trade was that it very, very frequently separated people from their families. So if it was routine for wives to be shipped away from husbands, for children to be shipped away from parents, for siblings to be split apart. And often they were split apart, at the initial purchase in Maryland, but if not there, they were often split apart from New Orleans, for example. The wife could be sold to one plantation, the husband to another. But families were shattered between about 1810 and the Civil War. So for 50 years or so, this domestic slave trade thrived. The estimate is that about 1 million people were forced south during that period, an enormous forced migration. And for decades after the Civil War, after emancipation, you can find Black families advertising, placing classified ads in newspapers all around the country, saying, "Help me find my mother, help me find my daughter. My brother was sold to a man named Slatter back in 1840. We never heard from him again." Because if someone was taken by Slatter and put on a ship, you had absolutely no way of knowing where they ended up, no way of writing to them. So literally, they were disappearing, and so families were trying to stitch the family back together for decades after emancipation, and often, people who've studied these ads say that in the vast majority of cases they were unsuccessful. So it was a huge part of the crime of slavery, and the nature of this domestic slave trade really should be better known and better understood, I think.
And now it is, all thanks to your description of it, and thanks to your book. There were insuperable barriers, one would think, in the years following emancipation to trying to reconnect these families.
Absolutely.
You can imagine maybe illiteracy on the other end, the recipient.
Yeah.
They might not be able to read, and we take so for granted the fact that we can drop a pin
Yes.
on anyone. And
Yeah.
As I'm out on a long run, for instance, which is what I do, I'll share my location with all my family. So if I'm 12 miles from my apartment, they'll know precisely where I am, better than I could even know.
I mean, this was a different world, not only illiteracy, but just knowing, where you were supposed to direct a letter to someone who had disappeared a month or a year earlier.
How do you even begin that process? To me, it's unfathomable.
Yeah, and it was. And so, in fact, Slatter and the other slave traders often moved people to ships at night, because if they did it during the day, there were often relatives and friends of the enslaved who would follow the procession of chained people traveling to the harbor to get on a ship, and they would be wailing and they would be shouting and they would be protesting. And in fact, Hope Slatter even dug a tunnel to carry people from his jail a couple blocks to the inner harbor in Baltimore, apparently with the purpose of hiding them from the public, this kind of grim business, both from the public and also from the specific people who were heartbroken to know that their loved ones were literally disappearing to a place that they might never, they might never see them again. Something that I should say, because in some ways it was, for me, the biggest revelation of my research for this book, is the connection between the domestic slave trade on the one hand and the Underground Railroad on the other hand. Because it turns out, as you look at these individual cases of escape, in many, many, many cases, people are escaping from this region in particular because they're making this momentous, fraught decision to run for it, basically, at huge risk to their lives, risk of being sold south as punishment for trying to escape. So it's a big decision, and even if you have the help of somebody like Smallwood,
yes. So tell us more, because I think this is a good opportunity to expand upon the Underground Railroad. Again, this is a concept of which I think most Americans have but a hazy idea. We think Underground Railroad, we associate it with Harriet Tubman, rightly or wrongly.
Right.
And right, but I'm saying we should also acknowledge,
some other folks,
Smallwood, Smallwood and Torrey, who were able to spirit away many, many people, hundreds. But a lot of times we have difficulty exactly imagining what this is. We think, okay, well, maybe I've heard people say it was a literal railroad. Of course, it wasn't. So, describe to us what is the Underground Railroad?
Sure.
Who coined it, and how did it sustain itself? How did it move forward?
Okay. So as I was saying, many of the people, it turns out, who are motivated to escape, to take the enormous risk of escaping, are motivated because they learn they may be sold south. So you have the domestic slave trade which is putting everyone in this region, everyone in the Upper South, basically, in an impossible predicament. They know, because of what's happened to their neighbors, their friends, sometimes to family members, that at any day, at any time, somebody can show up, put shackles on them, and cart them away. And if they get wind that maybe they're in danger of this fate that they are terrified of, that may be the moment where they say, okay, I don't care about the risks, I'm taking off tonight. And if they get the assistance of somebody like Smallwood, who knows the ropes and has, and can organize a wagon load and, has safe houses where the wagon can stop for the night on the way north, that makes it much more feasible, much more comfortable to make that decision. But often Smallwood says the people coming to him and saying, I want to get out of here, were motivated because, for example, they learned that their enslaver is on his deathbed. And often when the enslaver dies, the enslaved people are a part of the estate, and they can be sold off to God knows where, including to the Deep South. So as they see this possibility on the horizon, and I should say that in some cases, the enslaver literally threatens to sell the person because they don't like, the quality of their work or whatever it is, or just to motivate them to work harder. If you don't work harder, I'm going to put you in my pocket. That was literally the phrase that was used, because all you had to do was drop a note to a guy like Hope Slatter. His boys would come by and pick the person up and hand over hundreds of dollars in cash. So that's what they meant by putting you in my pocket. So as soon as somebody threatened to put you in my pocket, you were motivated to think about other options. So, there have been escapes from slavery in every society where slavery has existed, of course, the entire history of the institution of slavery. But it really became a phenomenon in the 1840s, particularly with these guys in this particular region. There were other places. Crossing the Ohio River from Kentucky into Ohio was another major site of escapes, but passing from the Mid-Atlantic up into Pennsylvania was, and then farther north, was very much a phenomenon. And it predated Smallwood and Torrey, certainly. But I think they were the first to kind of organize mass escapes and to, do it on a large scale, do it consistently, and to kind of organize the route north in that area. So they did not call it the Underground Railroad when they were starting out. But they did organize what we think of as the Underground Railroad. And Smallwood describes how they had a place of deposit, as he called it, about, I believe he says, 37 miles north of Washington, or where he was in Washington, which would put it right around Baltimore, in Baltimore, or right around Baltimore. And he had a Baltimore ally, a guy named Jacob Gibbs, an African-American house painter, who was his main man in Baltimore. So I think he was probably the guy who was organizing safe places for them to spend a day. They're traveling at night and then hiding for the day and then traveling again at night. They tried to reach Pennsylvania on the third night. So they had a sort of organized system with a bunch of allies. And that was, very much what we came to call the Underground Railroad. What was so interesting in reading over these newspaper dispatches of Smallwood, I, literally stumbled upon the phrase Underground Railroad. And I believe it is the first time that phrase was used to describe escapes from slavery in print ever. And, essentially Smallwood is quoting the words of an infamous police constable and slave catcher. because I have a chapter on the police, and a lot of the early police officers in Washington, Baltimore, other places made a lot of their money running after people who had escaped slavery, returning them to their enslavers and collecting the reward money. And it could be quite a lucrative business sideline. So this particular guy named John Zell was apparently baffled by the number of escapes that was taking place, the number of people escaping, and how were these people getting away. And this was his bread and butter. So he was heard to exclaim, they must be getting away by underground railroad or steam balloon, because basically I don't know how they're getting away. So there were railroads, of course, at the time, but there were no underground railroads, and steam balloons were sort of an experimental technology, I guess you could say. So essentially he's saying these people must be teleporting themselves to the north, or they must be abducted by aliens. I don't know how they're getting away. And so it's an expression of frustration, a kind of colorful expression of frustration on his part. So Smallwood hears about this. I assume he wasn't standing there when John Zell exclaimed this, though he may have been. Anyway, he heard that this character had made this frustrated remark, and he quotes it in addressing a slaveholder, as usual, essentially saying, dude, I can't tell you how your enslaved workers got away, but maybe they got away on this underground railroad this cop was talking about. And he then clearly was taken by this notion of this mythical transport system. And so he starts riffing on the phrase in his letters. And over the next several months, he advises slaveholders whose human property has walked off to apply at the office of the Underground Railroad in Washington, of course, which did not exist, for further information on what might have happened to their enslaved workforce. And he appoints himself at one point general agent of all the branches of the National Underground Railroad. So he's just having a good old time using the notion of an underground railroad to ridicule the slaveholders, and particularly the slave catchers and the slave catching police officers, who can't figure out where people are going and how they're getting away, and how they're getting away in such numbers. So he repeatedly uses this idea of the Underground Railroad and sort of embellishes it in various ways. So, when I first came across this, I thought, God, it sounds like, he's talking about something that has not previously been widely discussed. Is it possible that this is actually the origin of this notion of an underground railroad, or this term? And so I looked at Wikipedia, like anyone would, right? And and other places, and you find that there are a couple of stories that had been often reprinted, repeated with variations about how the Underground Railroad got its name, both dating to the 1830s. But if you take a hard look at these stories, it becomes clear that they're folklore, and they involve people remembering things from decades before, and scholars had generally not credited them. So generally, serious scholars had said, we don't really know where this term comes from. So then I looked into the big, wonderful, digitized databases of 19th century newspapers that have only become available, in the last 10 or 15 years, and are still growing, richer with every day as newspapers get digitized and added. But they go back way before the 1840s now. And so I just put the term Underground Railroad into the search into these big newspaper databases. And of course, you have to word it not only the way we write it, but also sometimes it's 4 words: Underground Railroad, which was often the way it was written those days. Anyway, but if you look into the 2 big databases I used, was newspapers.com and another one called genealogybank.com. And in both cases, of tens of thousands of uses of that phrase, the first ones come from Thomas Smallwood. So I think it's safe to say that while perhaps this notion of a fantasy Underground Railroad, used sarcastically probably, was floating around, perhaps this cop was not the first to use the term. Maybe he picked it up from somewhere else. But in terms of actually becoming part of the language, I think it's very much due to Thomas Smallwood. You can kind of look, you can see how after Smallwood, and Torrey picks it up from Smallwood and uses it when he's editor of the Albany paper. And even in advertising the paper, he says, everybody loves Sam Weller's stories of the Underground Railroad. So he starts using the term. And, you can start seeing other papers picking it up in the same spirit that Smallwood is using it, essentially as a way of mocking those who cannot understand how people are escaping slavery. But then within a couple of years, it becomes almost a generic term for escapes from slavery, especially escapes that get some help from other people. But it was still very interesting to me to see that it originates with Smallwood as essentially one more way of beating up on the slaveholders in the institution of slavery. Because later on, Underground Railroad takes on a kind of almost reverential quality. It's often capitalized, and it's almost as if it's this organized, institutionalized bunch of good guys, and it's and sometimes obscures the fact that basically the prime movers in escaping from slavery were those who were escaping, who often did it without much help. And I also came to feel that I'm writing about these two phenomena, the domestic slave trade and the Underground Railroad. One of them, the Underground Railroad, is widely celebrated in American culture. There are movies, there are books. It's taught in elementary school. It's quite well known. Everybody knows what you mean when you say Underground Railroad. And nobody knows what you mean when you say the domestic slave trade. And I think there's, alas, a reason for that. And that is that the Underground Railroad has room for white heroes, for good-hearted white people who are playing some role in helping people escape slavery. The domestic slave trade has no room for good-hearted white people. There were no good-hearted, heroic white people involved in the domestic slave trade. So it's just funny how the filtering process works and how we learn a great deal about one thing and not about the other. And I think the Underground Railroad also provides Americans, both black and white, with a kind of kinder, gentler way to talk about slavery. It's sort of the less brutal, less heartrending side of slavery. So so all that emerged from my discovery that Thomas Smallwood appears to have essentially originated this phrase, the Underground Railroad, and think about kind of what that has come to mean.
And the fruits of your discovery are brimming out of this book and ripe for the picking. And I think, like I said earlier, will be very helpful to really coloring in some of the parts of our history that are somewhat somewhat obscure, I would say, or just overlooked completely. As you mentioned, there are a lot of dramatic portrayals of escape, of people going north, 12 Years a Slave, for instance, and some of the other ones. I was trying to think of the alternative, a good depiction of the harsh, brutal reality of enslavement in the Deep South. And funnily enough, when you were talking about coffles, I was reminded of the opening scene of Quentin Tarantino's great work, Django Unchained. Now, of course, it's his idiosyncratically, inimitably sanguinary and kind of crude and cruel depiction of slavery. But that's a good idea of what was happening. And you would have
Mhm.
a train of men
Yes.
shackled together, shuffling as they had by their sides two less than amicable slave drivers, basically
Yes.
shepherding them to the south, to the estate of Monsieur Candide, that
Yes,
that
exactly.
character
Yeah.
played by Leonardo
Yeah.
DiCaprio. So although there's a tint of humor, as there always is in
Mhm.
a Tarantino work, and
Mhm.
in the over the top bloodshed, I
Mhm.
think that is a decent portrayal of what was happening at that
Yes.
time, and yeah, and certainly doesn't shine a favorable light upon the white people
Yeah.
involved, and that's good because
And
that
you can understand why somebody who has who's living in, particularly in the cities, Washington, Baltimore, uh, where there were large enslaved populations, but even larger free black populations, and where the slavery regime had to be kind of modified. For example, if you wanted to send someone to buy food at the market, you had to trust them somewhat. You had to give them money. If you wanted them to take your kids to school, if you wanted them to be useful in an urban setting, they couldn't just be, chained laborers picking cotton. So for a lot of the people up here, they imagined, not entirely incorrectly, that they were in danger of being sold into the world of Django Unchained, and so you can kind of understand why that might be the moment where they would say, I've been thinking about this, and tonight there's no moon, and I'm out of here. So
yeah.
or I'm gonna go look up that shoemaker Thomas Smallwood, who I hear might be up to something along these lines, and see if he can give me some help to get out of here.
I think it's important to note also, just in passing, that while most of us like to think that were we in that setting, let's say as Black Marylanders,
Mm-hmm.
that we would have the courage to make that escape.
Yeah.
But I think it would be presumptuous of us to assume that we all would. And
Yeah.
this isn't something upon which we need to expand, but it's just a thought, one of these
Yeah.
thought experiments. Like, if you were in that situation in 1843 and you were an enslaved man living in Baltimore,
Mm-hmm.
with a relatively humane master, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I know it's uncomfortable to have that thought, but would you take it upon yourself to try to make that escape and risk
Yes.
being captured by the brutal fugitive
Yeah.
slave lawman? You know, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure where I come down
Yes.
on it. Of course, there'd be
Well,
so many conditions.
and I think the question that accompanies that I thought about a lot is, let's say you were living in that world and you were an abolitionist, you were an opponent of slavery, you're an anti-slavery person, you hated the institution of slavery. Uh, would you have the guts? Would you have the really reckless daring to risk everything, to risk your freedom and perhaps your life, to sneak around at night, trying to organize escapes from slavery? I mean, these guys were fighting the great injustice of their time and risking everything to do it, as their stories essentially show. And I've often asked myself, would I have anything like that kind of courage?
What do you think?
If,
What is the what to what conclusion have you arrived?
I fear, as a humble newspaper reporter, that I would not have that
Mm.
kind of just sort of staggering courage.
Yeah. And there's a continuum,
That it
and there's a
takes.
continuum of courage. All right. Like on one end, at the very extreme end, you have a man like John Brown, and
Yeah.
he's willing really to sacrifice everything, his
Yeah.
life and that of his compatriots,
Yes.
to terminate this institution.
Yes.
Maybe just shy of the completely violent tactics, you have a man like Torrey. And
Mhm.
maybe this is a good time to tell us a little bit about his end. It's an
Yeah.
inglorious end. He doesn't, he's not exalted up into the firmament as a hero of the Republic. Maybe you can
Yeah.
tell us briefly about how
Sure.
he came to his end.
So, this is a very young man. When he meets Thomas Smallwood and they embark on this enterprise, he's only 28 years old, as I recall. And Smallwood is about 40 at the time. And he ends up being arrested. And this is illegal. This is literally against the law to entice or assist, as the wording of the law was, someone to escape slavery that prescribed a penalty of going to prison. And he was in fact put on trial. He was imprisoned, and he was put in the Maryland penitentiary, sentenced to 6 years. And he had a chronic infection with tuberculosis, which had killed both his parents and his sister. And that from time to time had left him extremely ill. But the chronic infection with tuberculosis, you would get better, you would get worse, but it wouldn't go away. There was no way to treat it really effectively at the time. There were no antibiotics. And so he eventually dies in prison. And while it's true that he doesn't become a household name, he is celebrated in the abolitionist communities, particularly in his native Massachusetts. And, there's a kind of instant biography written of him, which is mostly pieced together from his journals, from Charles Torrey's journals and correspondence. And it's published. There's a big funeral attended by hundreds of people in Boston. And there's a big monument to Charles Torrey at his grave site in Cambridge, Mass. Beautiful old cemetery there. So while he's not at all a household name, he gets a considerable amount of attention. And in fact, a distant relative of Charles Torrey, a prominent psychiatrist by the name of Fuller Torrey, E. Fuller Torrey, wrote a very good biography of Torrey, which was published in 2013. So he is, there's some record of what he was up to and what he did. Whereas for Thomas Smallwood, there is none of that. He left a memoir that he wrote in 1851, a short memoir. One kind of senses that he wanted to put on the records some of what he'd done, because nobody else was putting on the record. These letters, these wonderful letters he wrote to the Albany paper, were basically lost for practical purposes. In fact, Smallwood in his memoir reprints one such letter, and says he wishes he had the others, but he had to destroy them because the police were basically sniffing around his home in D.C., and it was dangerous to have them have the proof that he was this character, Sam Weller. And so he has really been lost to history. And I think between his heroic activities in the Underground Railroad, his sort of historical significance in giving the Underground Railroad its name, and his literary significance in penning this really unique work of satire about the institution of slavery in the 1840s, I think he deserves to be very much better known. And if there's one hope I have for this book, is that it kind of puts Thomas Smallwood back on the map. And, I hope someday there will be some kind of memorial to him, recognizing his achievements in D.C., where he did most of this work.
Yeah, so let me ask you, do you think that Smallwood's star will rise and he'll eventually find himself inhabiting the same firmament as the likes of Tubman and Douglas and Boy and Booker T. Washington?
Yeah.
Will he be shining amongst these luminary American figures?
That is my hope. That's what that is certainly my hope. I think that's what he deserves. You wish you could bring back Thomas Smallwood and just, for one thing, you could bring him back today. And I think he had quite a jaundiced view of race in America. He urged people to go to Canada because he thought they would never get, even in freedom, a fair deal from the United States of America. And he had a pretty dark view, having experienced life in slavery and life in freedom, in so-called freedom, as an African American in the United States. He had a pretty dark view of the future of race relations and racial equality in the United States. And, I'm sorry to say that if we brought him back and told him there was this guy, George Floyd, we told him about the behavior of police, we told him about the ratio of income or household wealth between white people and black people in America today, I think he would not be surprised, because he was very prescient about the problems facing African Americans. And so it would be great to bring him back and show him around and tell him, at least, there is a book now that attempts to do justice to what you achieved. But I really do hope, from months I had been thinking there really ought to be a statue of this guy in Washington. And then belatedly it occurred to me that I'd been looking for several years now for any image whatsoever of Thomas Smallwood. And so far, I have struck out. So I appeal to Smallwood, lived to a ripe old age and died in 1883, well into the photography era. So I appeal to your listeners and viewers to look out for any pictures they might find of Thomas Smallwood, because I realize there might be a little bit of a problem in building a statue of man when we don't know what he looked like. But maybe there's another kind of memorial we can build, or a historical plaque or something. But this guy deserves it. He's a fascinating character, and it was really a privilege to tell his story.
And it was a pleasure to be able to read it from a hand like yours. Let me ask you, and maybe we'll conclude on these two questions.
Sure.
Easy question. To what restaurant would you bring him if he were to be living amongst us today? Now, you're in Baltimore, a city famous for its seafood. So where would you go to him? Where would you go together?
Well, now, Thomas Smallwood does not mention eating steamed crabs. And I don't even know if they used to steam crabs in the same way. I know they ate crabs, and actually oysters, interestingly enough, in those days were, black folks kind of had a corner on the oyster market, strangely enough. There were oyster stands and oyster restaurants run by black people in those days. So maybe this would appeal to him. He does talk about, in one note directed to Torrey, he talks about the green peas, the fresh green peas at Gadsden's, I think it's called, a restaurant in D.C. So, he was a man who apparently liked to eat. So I think I would take him to a crab house on the harbor, and we could look out at it and at least celebrate the fact that the slave trade is long gone, and and talk things over. And I'd give a lot for that.
Yeah, and with what question do you think you would lead? What would you ask him first?
I think I would recount to him the regress and progress in race relations in the United States, which I think of as the question around which American history turns, basically, and kind of bring him up to date, which would take some doing. But as I say, I don't think he would be shocked, but you'd have to go over the sort of period of slavery by another name, the end of Reconstruction, and peonage and prison labor and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act and so on. And once we got all the way up through George Floyd and, to two black justices on the Supreme Court, and, by the way, there was a black president and so on. And we kicked all that around, and that would take several dozen crabs, I think, and maybe a couple of steins of beer. But anyway, pitchers of beer. But I think I would ask him, like, what do you make of all that? You were someone who, were quite unusual in having experienced slavery, experienced the sort of extremely restricted freedom that a black man could have in Washington, D.C. in the 1840s. Also experienced life in Canada, spoiler alert. And you wrote about this. You clearly thought about it a lot. What did you anticipate about the way things might develop? What do you make of this? And and by the way, if we if we can elect you to public office now that we've brought you back, what would you do about it? Anyway, I just think the guy had such insight and such an array of ways of thinking about these problems, from out and out outrage and fury on the one hand, to humor and to sort of powerful satire on the other. He would just be so interesting to talk to about all these problems we face.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd like to be a fly on that wall as you do. Shuck crabs and eat oysters and talk about all these grave issues and enduring issues.
Absolutely.
So, Scott, I mean, you've been absolutely generous with your time. This has been an extraordinary conversation. I've loved every minute of it. Again, I encourage all the listeners and all the viewers to pick up a copy of Flee North, A Forgotten Hero, and the Fight for Freedom in Slavery's Borderland. It's really a work that we all need to be familiar with, because its characters, I think, are indispensable in really understanding American history. Scott, do you have any parting messages for the audience today?
None. But go read about Thomas Smallwood and spread the word.
We shall. So with that, I bid thee all farewell from Finneran's Wake. Thank you very much.